Welcome to the debut episode of Saturn Side, a companion series to the PlayStation experiment covering the Sega Saturn. When I started the PlayStation experiment, I knew that capturing the full breadth of the 5th generation of video game consoles would necessitate coverage of PlayStation competitors such as the Sega Saturn and Nintendo 64. Initially, I planned on including occasional summaries as features included in mainline PlayStation experiment episodes. But as I considered the depth and quality of the libraries of platforms such as the Sega Saturn, Nintendo 64, and even less successful competitors such as the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer and NEC's PCFX, I realized that there was much more to say than what could be included in cursory overviews. Saturn Side is the first of several companion series that will join the PlayStation experiment as the scope of the project expands to include the entirety of the 5th generation of consoles. These series will focus on their respective platforms' exclusive releases as well as their unique histories. PlayStation releases that appeared on other platforms will still be covered on the PlayStation experiment. Significant differences between versions will be covered in the PlayStation experiment coverage of those releases. The relatively small number of releases that appeared on more than one non-PlayStation 5th generation console, but not on the PlayStation, will be covered on one of the companion series, with the choice of series decided on a case-by-case basis. Since the Sega Saturn has a sizable library of exclusives, Saturn Side will be one of the biggest companion series to the PlayStation experiment, and I couldn't be more excited. The Saturn is an incredibly unique console. Its complex architecture made it less developer-friendly than the PlayStation, but those who took the time to get acquainted with the Saturn's dual SH2 CPUs and VDPs were able to deliver some of the most stunning experiences of the 5th generation of consoles. It was a modest commercial success in Japan, but struggled to compete elsewhere. As a result, its library errs towards the taste of Japanese hardcore gamers of the 90s. With a strong first-party lineup comprised of some of Sega's most daring and original efforts, joined by a veritable feast of lovingly ported 2D arcade games, and standout exclusives from developers such as Treasure that took the time to learn how to harness the system's power. This first episode of Saturn Side covers releases from the console's Japanese debut on November 22, 1994 through the end of the year. But before we dive into the games, let's take a look at the lead-up to the Sega Saturn's Japanese launch.
Hey, how do you do? I'm Lou Rawls, and I've been waiting for you. Listen, I want to show you my new living room. It is so cool. You're gonna really dig it. Come on, let's check it out. This is it. Welcome to the next living room.
In 1994, Sega was king shit of Fuck Mountain. Its 16-bit console, known as the Genesis in North America and the Mega Drive elsewhere, was giving Nintendo a serious run for its money in the video game console space. In America, the Genesis was going blow for blow against the Super Nintendo, and playing Sega was starting to displace playing Nintendo in the casual vernacular. In PAL territories such as Europe, where Sega had already made inroads with its 8-bit Master System, the Mega Drive was even more dominant. Even in Japan, traditionally Sega's weakest region for console sales, the Mega Drive managed to hold its own with a smaller but more dedicated audience. Sega was absolutely crushing it in arcades as well, with only Namco able to compete with Sega's cutting-edge hardware such as the 2D powerhouse System 32 and the trailblazing polygon-based Model 1 and Model 2 boards. Its Model 1 fighting game, Virtua Fighter, which debuted in arcades towards the end of 1993, was a massive hit that created the 3D fighting game genre and set new standards for polygonal renderings of human characters in video games. A few months later, in March 1994, it rolled out the Model 2 hardware with Daytona USA, which would prove to be an even bigger hit, eventually going on to become one of the highest-grossing arcade games of all time. Daytona USA married the populist fervor of NASCAR with idyllic, occasionally surreal landscapes, all soundtracked by Takanobu Misuyoshi's fantastic pop fusion soundtrack, which prominently featured his enthusiastic vocals. When people wax ecstatic over Sega's Blue Skies aesthetic, this is what they're talking about. There was nothing else like it in 1994, and few games since have surpassed it for pure hedonic thrills. Bigger still, though, was the February release of Sonic the Hedgehog 3, the next mainline game in Sega's wildly popular Sonic the Hedgehog series. Upon the arrival of his debut game in 1991, Sonic was an instant hit, winning over kids who found his edgier attitude a welcome alternative to Nintendo's banal plumber. The sequel, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, arrived in 1992, introducing Sonic's iconic pal Tails and cementing Sonic as the 16-bit generation's defining mascot. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 arrived amidst almost unreasonably high expectations, but surprisingly, it largely met them. It received an overwhelmingly positive critical reception, and sales were through the roof. Sega was seemingly on the cusp of becoming the dominant name in gaming, but dark clouds lay on the horizon. It already had one problem child. The Mega CD was a CD-ROM expansion for the Mega Drive that was released in Japan in December 1991 with a surprising lack of support from Sega or third parties. The only game that Sega published for the Mega CD in the first month of its release was Wakusei Woodstock: Funky Horror Band, an RPG starring a musical act consisting of 6 aliens. Funky Horror Band was a multimedia art project, not unlike the much more successful Gorillaz. They even released several albums, but the game was a stinker that looked and sounded like a sub-average Mega Drive game, save a few cinematic sequences featuring the Funky Horror Band's music. By the time of its 1992 release in America, where it was renamed to the Sega CD, and its 1993 release in Europe, there was a more robust lineup of releases ready, but the ambitious expansion was never quite the hit that Sega had envisioned. In America, the Sega CD mostly became known for its polarizing live-action FMV games, such as Sewer Shark and the controversial Night Trap. Despite eventually receiving some well-regarded exclusives such as Sonic CD and Lunar the Silver Star, by the end of 1994, it was already in decline, and it would be practically dead by 1995. Even the venerable Sonic seemed to be reaching a point of overexposure. Facing a tight deadline and ROM size limitations, Sonic the Hedgehog 3 was released with a significant amount of content cut. By October, a direct sequel, Sonic & Knuckles, was released in a special cartridge with lock-on technology, which allowed the Sonic 3 cartridge to piggyback on top so the complete version of the game could be played. Sonic & Knuckles was also highly successful critically and commercially, and the combined Sonic 3 and Knuckles is often considered the pinnacle of the 16-bit Sonic games. But there was already a sense that, with a new generation of console hardware looming, Sonic would need to do something different in his next game. Meanwhile, Nintendo was getting ready to hit back. In November, just a month after Sonic & Knuckles was released, Nintendo unleashed Donkey Kong Country, a reboot of the Donkey Kong franchise with a new redesign of the titular gorilla that imbued him with rude-tude and made extensive use of pre-rendered 3D sprites. Donkey Kong Country was an instant success, wowing critics and the public. Alongside an edgy Play It Loud ad campaign and a loosening of content restrictions that allowed popular games like Mortal Kombat 2 to appear on its platforms without major cuts, Donkey Kong Country spearheaded a revival of Nintendo's fortunes. Rumors of a next-generation Sega console began swirling around midway through 1993. Sega was working on several console hardware projects simultaneously, using code names based on the names of the planets of the solar system. There were two consoles in development that were considered the top contenders: the Jupiter, a cartridge-based console, and the Saturn, a CD-ROM-based console. Most sources paint these as consoles that would have identical hardware save to Saturn's edition of a CD-ROM drive, with a CD-ROM add-on available for users that wanted to upgrade the lower-priced Jupiter. Regardless, Sega publicly confirmed that the Jupiter was dead by March 1994. The project didn't seem to get very far along in development. There's no known prototype hardware or games for the Jupiter. The idea of a second next-generation console wasn't entirely dismissed by Sega, though. Another project, codenamed Mars, was in development at Sega of America. As with much of the history behind Sega from this era, the exact details are murky, but reportedly then-president of Sega, Hayao Nakayama, was concerned about the looming threat of the Atari Jaguar. A discussion including him, key Sega hardware engineer Hideki Sato, and several higher-ups at Sega of America, including Senior VP of Product Development Joe Miller, led to Miller pitching an add-on for the Genesis that incorporated the same dual SH2 CPUs that would power the Saturn. Per a 2013 interview by Sega 16's Ken Horowitz with Joe Miller, this discussion happened at the January 1994 Winter CES, which would certainly align with the timing of the cancellation of the Jupiter project and the 32X's obviously rushed release. But at the time, it was agreed that a Genesis hardware expansion was the best course forward to fend off the Jaguar until the Saturn was ready, so the 32X was chosen in lieu of the Jupiter project. The Saturn itself went through numerous revisions during development. There was a question of how prominent 3D games would be in the next-generation console gaming landscape, and what expectations may be for the quality of 3D graphics on consoles. It became clear fairly quickly that the Saturn would need to be powerful enough to pull off reasonably accurate ports of Sega's Model 2 arcade games, in much the same way that the Genesis was capable of reasonably accurate ports of its System 16 arcade games. At the same time, Sega was reluctant to abandon its strengths in 2D game development, so the Saturn also had to excel at traditional sprite-based graphics. This is where the story gets complicated. There are conflicting sources about the evolution of the Saturn's hardware design. Contemporary gaming magazines were rife with rumors and technical specs that sometimes seemed pulled out of thin air, with various suggested permutations of the Saturn as a 32-bit or 64-bit console, and possible CPUs including more powerful variants of the Genesis's 68,000 CPU, such as the 68020 and 68040, and the Arcade System 32 board's NEC V60. The most in-depth contemporary account of the Saturn's hardware development is in the January 1995 issue of Edge, coming right on the heels of the Saturn's Japanese launch. According to the feature article, after Nakayama learned about the upcoming Sony PlayStation's powerful 3D capabilities, he chewed out the hardware development team for failing to create a next-generation console that could compete. This led to a several-month delay to add a new video processor, presumably the VDP-1, which is the Saturn's custom graphics chip based on the Model 1 and 2 arcade hardware. Edge pegs this redesign as starting in November 1993 after the PlayStation's public unveiling, but a number of other sources point to this having occurred far earlier in development, if at all. While the narrative that Sega added polygonal capabilities to the Saturn at the last minute has been commonly reported through the years, a February 2018 interview with Hideki Sato paints a more nuanced portrait of the console's development. Sato was an engineer and executive at Sega who spent a large chunk of his career developing console hardware with his team, having had a hand in virtually all of Sega's console hardware from the SG-1000 through the Dreamcast. He even briefly served as Sega's president during its difficult transition from the Dreamcast to a multi-platform third-party publisher and developer. Sato spoke at length for a video game history research project with the Innovation Research Center at Hitotsubashi University. The complete Japanese transcript of the interview is over 150 pages. While the interview has not been translated into English in full, John Harrison of Mega Drive Shock has translated a few choice bits. Per Sato, the 68020 was pushed by Sega America to be the CPU of Sega's next-generation console, largely because it would be possible to easily build a system that was a souped-up Genesis. But Sato correctly realized that this would be an insufficient jump in power. He eventually went with the Hitachi SH2 after a deal was cemented between Sega and Hitachi towards the end of 1992. He mentions the NEC V-Series in passing as well, but it doesn't seem to have been seriously considered for the Saturn CPU. Sato also discusses the shift towards a more 3D-focused machine being driven by the PlayStation. It's very likely, though, that this shift occurred far earlier than contemporary sources like the Edge article indicate. Sega almost certainly had at least some prior knowledge of the PlayStation and a basic idea of its capabilities. Sato even mentions a friendly rivalry with PlayStation hardware designer Ken Kutaragi, with whom he would have dinner every few months while they were working on the Saturn and PlayStation. However, it is also undisputed that Sega was taken aback upon seeing the final hardware specs of the PlayStation when it was revealed in late 1993, and this led to a significant hardware change to the Saturn. Seeing that the PlayStation could handle 300,000 polygons per second, Sato realized that the Saturn needed a little bit of extra horsepower to compete. Running out of time to finalize the hardware, he took advantage of the ability to link multiple SH2 CPUs together by adding a second SH2 to bump up performance. It worked, but at the expense of creating a machine that required programmers with sufficient skill to take advantage of dual CPUs, something that was rare at the time. While we may never have the full details of the Saturn's hardware development, there's strong evidence that points to a timeline where the Saturn had hardware support for rendering polygonal graphics added relatively early in its development, perhaps with a shift in the middle of development towards a more capable 3D machine after getting wind of the competition. But the final significant hardware change was adding a second SH2 around a year before the console's release, upon realizing some extra CPU horsepower was needed. This timeline is further bolstered by comments from Yoji Ishii, a Sega producer who worked in the arcade division up until the beginning of 1993, when he was ordered by Nakayama to move to the console division to focus on building out its abilities to develop 3D games, as well as the hardware specifications provided by Sega at the Saturn's January 1994 debut at Winter CES, which include the dual SH2 CPUs and graphical capabilities in line with the two VDPs that would end up in the final hardware. What is very clear is that the result of these hardware revisions was a console that was powerful, but complicated, and it didn't help that developers would have less than a year with the final hardware to not only get acquainted with it, but ship a game for it. Sega's internal software developers very obviously struggled with the machine early on. Third-party developers and even second-party partners fared even worse. The initial development tools were sorely lacking, and early developers were stuck with writing assembly language for an unfamiliar processor architecture. While support for the C programming language and better development libraries eventually came along, truly tapping the Saturn's power still required skilled assembly coding and a deep understanding of the hardware. Perhaps most tellingly, even Sega luminary Yu Suzuki, producer and director of Virtua Fighter, conceded that only around 1 in 100 programmers had the skill to fully utilize the dual CPU architecture. The Saturn's initial release schedule was lighter than the PlayStation's. On launch day, there were 5 titles available, 2 from Sega and 3 from third-party publishers. The most important one was undoubtedly the hotly anticipated port of Virtua Fighter, which was so popular in Japan that it's almost certainly the single reason why the Saturn outsold the PlayStation that holiday season. Sega's only other launch title was WanChai Connection, a menu-based adventure game that promised a thrilling detective mystery told across 2 discs of live-action FMV. 2 of the 3 third-party launch titles were also PlayStation launch titles. Mahjong Goku Tenjiku is exactly the same as its PlayStation counterpart. Tama, Adventurous Ball and Giddy Labyrinth, is just a smidge smoother on the Saturn, hinting that it was likely the game's lead platform. But the game's major flaws are still very much present, so this version still can't really be recommended. The final launch title was a port of the hit computer CD-ROM adventure Myst. It shows up on the PlayStation in January, so it'll be covered in the near future on the PlayStation Experiment. After that, only 3 more titles arrived in December, all exclusives published by Sega. 2 of them were released on December 2nd, Gale Racer, a renamed port of the System 32 game Radmobile, and The Mansion of Hidden Souls, a sequel to the almost identically named Sega CD adventure game Mansion of Hidden Souls. Finally, Clockwork Knight, a 2D platformer that made impressive use of polygonal graphics, rounded out the year a week later on December 9th. Then it was crickets until over halfway into January. This relatively meager lineup was typical of Japanese console releases of years prior. Sega launched the Mega Drive in October 1988 with 2 games, then only 2 more until February. Nintendo launched the Super Famicom similarly with 2 games in November 1990. 7 games followed in December, but then it took until nearly the end of February for a slow drip to resume. But Sony unleashed a torrent of releases for the PlayStation straight from the jump. 8 on launch day, 9 more through the rest of December, and then 7 more in January. It was nearly unprecedented for a console in Japan to have 10 releases in its first 2 months in the market, never mind over 20. Not all of these games were winners, but this first burst of releases was surprisingly strong. The PlayStation instantly looked like a contender. Meanwhile, the Saturn's early days were rough. Despite some bright spots, all of the releases covered on this episode feel like they were rushed out the door. But it's only up from here for the Saturn, as developers soon became better acquainted with the hardware and learned how to make it sing. The Saturn never quite managed to become the PlayStation killer that Sega envisioned, but it didn't go down without a fight. Virtua Fighter is less of a game than a pivotal moment in video game history. Sega's arcade fighter was a breakthrough in polygonal graphics that invented the 3D fighting game genre along the way. It was a sizable hit in arcades, especially in Japan, where it was the biggest arcade game of 1994 and went on to become one of its all-time highest-grossing arcade games. Magazines were rapturous in their praise for the game's stunningly animated fighters and nuanced, compelling gameplay, which eschewed the projectiles and outlandish moves of Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat in favor of realistic martial arts.
Fight! 1. Ready, go!
It was a foregone conclusion that Virtua Fighter, which ran on the same Model 1 hardware that powered the previous year's Virtua Racing, would find its way to Sega's home consoles. It was also obvious that the 16-bit Genesis, which just barely managed a playable port of Virtua Racing with the help of the expensive SVP add-on chip, wouldn't have the horsepower to do it justice. As it became clear in 1994 that Sega's flagship next-generation console was going to be the Saturn, all eyes were on the early footage of its Virtua Fighter port. This initial port of Virtua Fighter that arrived on the Saturn at its Japanese launch has a poor reputation. While it's successful at capturing the gameplay of the arcade Virtua Fighter, it makes significant compromises in the quality of the graphics, simplifying the character models and introducing some very noticeable graphical glitches and polygonal pop-in. The Saturn would soon prove itself a handily capable machine, but its Virtua Fighter port made it appear to be vastly inferior to the PlayStation in polygon-pushing power. And yet, contemporary reviews of the Saturn port of Virtua Fighter are generally quite positive. Famitsu gave it a 36 out of 40. Edge gave it a 9 out of 10. GameFan's 3 reviewers averaged out to around a 90 out of 100. EGM was slightly more lukewarm, averaging a smidge under an 8 out of 10. But even there, the lowest reviewer complains that they just don't like Virtua Fighter much in general. Even a review from the real hoi polloi, a poster on the ancient rec.games.video.sega Usenet group who imported their Saturn, describes it as awesome, all caps, although they also point out the glitchiness. The modern view that the port is something of a disappointment is closer to the truth than the hyperbole of 90s game critics and Usenet Sega stans. Placed within the context of its release, it's understandable why nearly everyone was enthused over even a mediocre home port of Virtua Fighter. And it is a very playable version of the game, in the same way that 16-bit home console ports of games like Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat were very playable despite obviously suffering significant cuts from their arcade counterparts. That was, for a brief moment in time, an acceptable compromise for a home port of a cutting-edge arcade game. But within a year, the PlayStation and Saturn had elevated the standard so much higher that people couldn't believe they used to settle for such garbage. But let's see if we can at least briefly imagine the moment when this port could inspire rave reviews. Virtua Fighter drew eyes in the arcade for its depiction of stunningly animated polygonal human characters who engaged in exquisitely choreographed combat that players could actually control. Polygons weren't exactly new when Virtua Fighter debuted in arcades in October 1993, but they were primarily used for abstract shapes, or real-world objects that didn't require much in the way of animation, such as cars and planes. Realistically animated humans rendered in real-time polygons was beyond what even the most powerful computers could handle. but attempts to depict polygonal human figures in video games date back at least as far as Atari's 1984 coin-op, iRobot, the first arcade game to fully render its graphics with real-time polygons. iRobot was a commercial flop, but it successfully translates the frenetic action of Golden Age arcade games to the polygonal realm. More importantly though, it puts you in control of a humanoid robot, albeit a stiff and unanimated one. The idea was there, it was just the technology that was lacking. Polygonal games in the 80s and early 90s worked around these limitations by trading arcade thrills for a more serious simulation approach, such as Microprose's Gunship, or occasionally more fanciful sci-fi space adventures such as Argonaut Software's Starglider 2. Even ambitious attempts at first-person navigation through polygonal renderings of real-world spaces, such as the games using Incentive Software's Freescape engine, avoided rendering human figures, leaving the player to explore eerie, largely empty environments. Incremental breakthroughs came over time, though. Starting with 1990's 4D sports tennis, Distinctive Software began creating versions of popular sports that featured polygonal human characters.
Love 30.
While 4D sports tennis's humans were crudely rendered, its 1991 follow-up, 4D boxing, is a significant improvement, with simple but cleanly animated boxers duking it out in the ring. Sports games were a natural avenue for breakthroughs in polygonal graphics, but it was an adventure game that would next set the high watermark for polygonal humans in video games. Infogrames' Lovecraftian proto-survival horror game Alone in the Dark, released for DOS in 1992, was slower paced than 4D boxing, but its characters were rich in detail and personality. Protagonist Edward Carnby traverses the game's mansion with a slightly lopsided gait and awkwardly fends off enemies with his fists and even a sword. Sega began its initial experimentation with polygonal human characters around the same time, with brief pit stop and victory sequences in Virtua Racing. The character models are more detailed than Alone in the Dark's, but they're still stiffly animated. These experiments led to more sophisticated motion tests that eventually paved the way for Virtua Fighter's impressively fluid and responsive characters. Any doubts that someone in 1993 may have had about the future of polygonal graphics in video games would have been instantly erased upon seeing Virtua Fighter. The game's backgrounds are simple, and the characters still lack the detail of the better pixel art of the era, but the game has everything that would come to define the evolution of polygonal games in Chrysalis. To stand in front of a Virtua Fighter arcade cabinet in 1993 was to see the next decade of video games unfurled before you. Given how revolutionary Virtua Fighter's polygonal graphics were, it's easy to forget that it was also a gameplay revolution. The fighting game genre had come into its own in the years prior. While 1991's Street Fighter II was not the first fighting game, it was the one that codified the basics of the genre. It was also an undeniably massive hit, and it inspired countless imitators. Over the next 2 years, a few other fighting games would establish themselves as serious competition to Street Fighter II. The most notable ones being Mortal Kombat and SNK's Neo Geo series such as World Heroes and Art of Fighting. By 1993, there was a fighting game fandom that was eager for new and fresh ideas. Street Fighter II was cresting in popularity. Super Street Fighter II, the latest revision of the game, was warmly received, but the gaming press was beginning to openly make jokes about Capcom being unable to count to 3 as yet another update of Street Fighter II rolled around. Mortal Kombat 2, released in November, was a massive hit. While SNK was honing its style with releases such as Samurai Showdown and Fatal Fury Special. There was still a hunger for more though, and Virtua Fighter forged an entirely different path with its 3D gameplay. In practice, most gameplay in Virtua Fighter is still locked to a 2D plane. Moving left and right moves you towards or away from your opponent, up jumps, and down ducks. It is possible for you and your opponent to become misaligned and move on separate planes, but you'll still only have 2D movement available. You have some limited ability to roll to the sides when getting up after a fall, but most of the time you and your opponent will shift positions in 3D based on being attacked. The arenas themselves are small rectangular spaces set against simple 2D backdrops. They aren't particularly appealing compared to the increasingly ornate backgrounds of 2D fighters of the era, but they're crucial to one of the game's other innovations. If your opponent falls outside of the arena, you instantly win with a ring-out victory. This is a clever solution to the problem of how to deal with players being able to run away from their opponent on a 3D plane, without wasting the Model 1's limited polygon budget on obstacles like walls. But it's also highly effective in ratcheting up the tension. You can never stray too far from your opponent, lest you risk falling off the edge of the arena, and it's very easy to knock your opponent off the edge with one carefully timed blow. Virtua Fighter only has 3 buttons: punch, kick, and block. It almost seems insufficient compared with the more complicated button setups of Street Fighter II, Mortal Kombat 2, and even SNK's Fighters, which were restricted to the Neo Geo's 4 buttons. But Virtua Fighter builds a satisfying and technically deep combat engine out of these simple controls. The trend in fighting games at this time was towards more ridiculous and unrealistic fighting styles. Mortal Kombat 2 was pushing beyond the original's ultra-violence into slapstick, and adding absurdities like babalities and friendships to its trademark fatalities. And also rans like Time Killers tried to stand out through shock value, with gimmicks like being able to amputate your opponent's limbs. But Virtua Fighter has no projectiles or fatalities or any other gimmicks. It's not exactly a simulation, but other than its floaty moon gravity jumps, it's fairly grounded. Virtua Fighter is also free of the common special move motions that were beginning to become codified in fighting games around this time. There are no quarter circle forward or dragon punch moves here. Many moves are as simple as forward plus punch, although there are some more complicated moves. That isn't to say that Virtua Fighter is easy or simple by any means. It's a very technical game with a high skill ceiling, but memorizing special command inputs is not the focus of the game. It's a game that rewards engaging with and learning its systems, rather than the dopamine hit of making your character unleash a fireball, or finish their opponent off with an amusing animation. This style of gameplay isn't for everyone. In Japan, Virtua Fighter was a hit not just for its graphics, but as a massively popular and highly competitive fighting game. But while the gameplay did find an appreciative audience in the West, coverage of the game was more graphically focused. A preview of the Saturn version in the November 1994 issue of Edge introduces it as a game that oozes over-the-shoulder appeal, and goes on to emphasize it as visually exciting. Some Western reviews even focused their criticism of the Saturn version on the gameplay rather than its graphical shortcomings. The review in the June 1995 issue of Video Games magazine actually compliments the visual fidelity of the port, while complaining about how even the arcade version was too slow and sluggish. These complaints aside, no one would deny that Virtua Fighter was innovating by moving fighting games into the third dimension. There are surprisingly almost no previous attempts at this kind of game. The closest there is to a predecessor is another Sega arcade game from 1993, Dark Edge for the System 32. Pushing the superscalar style to its limits, Dark Edge is graphically impressive, even rendering the reflections of characters and surfaces, such as on this stage that's apparently located in the muddy swamps of post-apocalyptic Hoboken, New Jersey. It has a small cast of imaginatively weird characters, but its gameplay is too shallow for it to have staying power. It took a while for any other 3D fighting games to emerge, although the first was, surprisingly, the Western-developed and console-exclusive Balls, released in fall of 1994 for Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. Developed by PF Magic, which would soon go on to greater success with the similarly named Dogs and Cats, Balls plays closer to Dark Edge than Virtua Fighter. But since it's on consoles with far weaker hardware than the System 32, it struggles to be much more than a briefly amusing novelty. It would take until Namco's Tekken arrived in arcades shortly after the Saturn's Japanese launch for some real competition to arrive. So now we're back to where we started. Why was the Saturn version of Virtua Fighter, widely considered a disappointment today, so positively received on release? In Japan, where Virtua Fighter was revered for its gameplay as much as its visuals, even a graphically compromised port was enough to propel the Saturn to an early lead over the PlayStation. In the West, the answer is even simpler. You just could not play anything close to this at home before. The initial wow factor was through the roof, but graphical standards shifted so rapidly that the game looked hopelessly dated by the end of 1995. Virtua Fighter would receive yet another Saturn port with updated graphics, Virtua Fighter Remix, just a few months later in 1995. This version was released in arcades for the STV board, which was essentially just Saturn hardware adapted for arcades. This version was also ported to Windows. We'll cover Virtua Fighter Remix in a later episode. A surprisingly well-done 32X port of the original game was released around the time of Virtua Fighter Remix as well. It accurately replicates the gameplay, but takes further hits to the visuals and music. There haven't been many efforts at preserving the original Virtua Fighter since then. There was a 10th anniversary version of the game for PlayStation 2 that was included as part of the special Memory of Decade box set, then later bundled with Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution, but it's based on the Virtua Fighter 4 engine rather than being an accurate recreation of the original game. If you want to play an unvarnished version of the arcade Virtua Fighter, you'll need to turn to the Astro City mini console that Sega released in 2020. Virtua Fighter marked the turning point in games where polygons began to supersede pixels. Incredibly, it also created a new kind of fighting game along the way. For that, it deserves a place in history. Should you still play it today? Probably not, unless it's for historical purposes. Virtua Fighter was rapidly obsoleted by its descendants, including its sequel, which arrived in arcades at around the same time as the Saturn's Japanese launch, and would receive an incredible port a year later. But on November 22, 1994, just being able to play a round of Virtua Fighter in the comfort of your home was magic. WanChai Connection is the only game other than Virtua Fighter that Sega published for the Saturn on its Japanese launch day. A menu-based adventure game similar in style to the ones that dominated Japanese microcomputers of the 80s and 90s, WanChai Connection is a classic detective story set in the bustling commercial neighborhood of WanChai, Hong Kong. With a generous helping of live-action FMV spread across 2 discs, WanChai Connection is narratively ambitious and surprisingly meaty, but it also suffers from the worst habits of Japanese adventure game design. In WanChai Connection, you play as Michael Lee, a young up-and-coming detective who works in the Hong Kong Police Department. After an amnesiac woman is found injured and nude in a burlap sack washed up on the shore, Lee finds himself investigating who and what is behind her attempted murder. What he finds unravels a startlingly far-reaching plot that expands to include some of the most prominent figures in WanChai. In the moment-by-moment gameplay, WanChai Connection most closely resembles Riverhill Soft's JB Herald series of games, probably best known in the West for its debut entry, JB Herald Murder Club, which was localized into English and released for the TurboGrafx CD and MS-DOS. Much like the JB Herald games, you are a detective working within the rules of police investigation. No breaking and entering or other legally questionable hijinks here. You've got to do it by the book. This particular detective subgenre of Japanese adventure games relishes in the slow burn. You spend the vast majority of your time interviewing witnesses and potential suspects, painstakingly building up a web of connections between the key players. You occasionally pick up evidence, but this is almost always an item to bring back to the lab for analysis, or to present to interviewees, rather than one used for puzzle solving. You eventually build up enough of a case to arrest some folks and bring them in for interrogation. The game comes to its thrilling conclusion when one or more of the suspects confesses. After a dramatic opening FMV, you're dumped into the screen where you'll be spending most of the game. WanChai Connection follows in JB Herald's footsteps stylistically, presenting itself as a series of windowed menus over a staid, static background. There are digitized photographs for each location and person, but they're presented in small windows layered on top of each other. It's like playing a game via an information kiosk. WanChai Connection doesn't make this work quite as well as JB Herald. It doesn't place the same care in how it composes its elements, and selecting locations to visit via a menu rather than a map, while a subtle change, deprives the game of the ability to tie these locations together into a coherent world. Locations themselves often lack compelling images, and you frequently find yourself shuttling back and forth between Business Building A and Business Building B, before a thrilling trip to a suburban residence. All of these kinds of games have to contend with how to reveal bits of the story while making the actual investigative gameplay enjoyable. This is often through forcing players to hit a certain number of conditions that trigger the necessary flags for the next big event to fire. This can result in frustration in 2 ways: knowing exactly what you need to do next but not knowing what additional flag you need to hit before the game moves on, or needing to retrace your steps to find the one small, seemingly inconsequential thing you missed before that triggers a counterintuitive leap of logic. Almost every game of this type suffers from this, even JB Herald, but WanChai Connection exacerbates this problem in 2 ways. The first is that the game is highly linear and broken up into 13 chapters. While there's some leeway to trigger, say, the 4 flags necessary to trigger the next event in any order, if you miss one of those flags, you may find yourself in a wild goose chase to track down the one you missed, completely stuck on any other progress until you find it. This can be a frequent problem with Japanese adventure games of this style, although the better ones, like the JB Herald series, offer some freedom to switch to following a different lead when another one seemingly turns cold. The second is that the game bafflingly limits how many topics you can ask about at a time. When you're at your desk at the police station, you can select a subset of topics from a larger list, which will have new topics added as you learn more during your investigation. The list of topics includes some very general questions, like the interviewee's name and their alibi, along with some very specific queries that arise deeper into the investigation. At its peak, this list of topics is so long that it would take 3 rounds of swapping topics to ask interviewees about all of them. This is a purely artificial gameplay limitation. There are separate lists of people and even physical pieces of evidence that can be used when questioning interviewees that suffer from no such limitations. WanChai Connection does have one surprising trick up its sleeve though. When the investigation shifts from interviewing to hunting for evidence, the game switches to a first-person view with fully polygonal graphics. These are presented in a window, and limited to around half of the screen, but they're surprisingly quite detailed. Unfortunately, they're infrequent and very short. There's maybe half a dozen or so occasions when they pop up, and they take around 10 minutes to complete. They feel shoehorned in at the last minute, which adds to the feel that WanChai Connection began life as a Mega CD game, and shifted development to Saturn when it became clear the Mega CD's days were numbered. My Japanese isn't good enough to follow the plot of WanChai Connection entirely, although machine translation did help out in spots. From what I could pick up though, it's a decent by-the-numbers detective story, but nothing special. What mainly distinguishes WanChai Connection is that it tells a far more mature story than the vast majority of console games that had come before it. WanChai Connection isn't exactly gritty. It's closer to a low-budget police procedural TV drama in video game form. But it does feature the kind of frank portrayal of violent crimes and romantic relationships that was almost unheard of in console games before. WanChai Connection even features openly queer characters that are portrayed in a fairly positive light. One of the suspects, Thomas Wang, is an elderly accountant and mahjong player who also happens to be secretly gay, and he eventually is forced to come out when it becomes relevant to the investigation. You even meet his partner, Travis, who works at a nearby snack bar. This obviously isn't especially great representation, but it bears noting because it was incredibly uncommon to see any queer characters in console gaming around this time, unless they were treated as cheap punchlines. These characters are presented as real people deserving of basic dignity and respect. At the end of the game, it is even revealed that Thomas and Travis are planning on moving to America, perhaps a place where they feel they may be able to live their lives more freely. However imperfect these characters' portrayals may be, this is subtly groundbreaking stuff for console games. While WanChai Connection was published by Sega, it was developed by Micronet, a relatively undistinguished company that is probably best known in the West for the 4 games it published in America under its comically named BigNet subsidiary, later renamed Extreme Entertainment Group. The company is most notorious for its mech-based fighting games, Heavy Nova and its sequel, Black Hole Assault, both of which received highly negative reviews. The company flitted about from genre to genre, never quite seeming to find its niche, although it managed to last long enough to push out a couple Dreamcast games before finally going kaput. WanChai Connection was Micronet's first and only adventure game, although the company did seem to have a bit of a specialty working with live-action FMV, which was mostly demonstrated in a number of mahjong games featuring attractive models. The cast of the live-action portions of WanChai Connection is mostly comprised of B and C tier character actors. Although unlike many FMV games, these are all established, professional actors with credits in major films and television series. The lead character of Michael Lee is played by Toshikazu Fukawa, an actor who seems to be best known for his role as Toshiyuki Koda in Ultraman Dyna, a late 90s entry in the ever-popular Ultraman Tokusatsu franchise. The amnesiac woman is played by Aya Sugimoto, a J-pop singer turned actress who is also known for her erotic writing, including the 2004 book, Orgasm Life. The original screenplay is credited to James Meeke, a well-known veteran screenwriter with a long list of film and television credits that stretches back to the late 60s. His film work includes April Fish, a collaboration of cult director Nobuhiko Obayashi and YMO drummer Yukihiro Takahashi, as well as Pink Lady no Katsudo Daisashin, the film starring Pink Lady, the Japanese pop duo that briefly achieved minor popularity in America in the late 70s. Meeke seems to have had the most success in television though, with his serialized limited series in the classic J-drama tradition, such as the apparently wildly popular and beloved Neo Sakushi. Meeke's involvement is most deeply felt in WanChai Connection's similarity to this variety of J-drama, although it's not really clear if he was all that involved in the game's actual production. Meeke was a pretty big get for Sega. He hadn't worked on a video game before, and he hasn't since, but there might be a reason why he was willing to give it a try. Meeke was going through a difficult divorce at the time from Noriko Yamashita, a noted author in her own right. Yamashita published a tell-all book titled Masked Couple in 1992 that revealed Meeke to be a serial adulterer who kept a journal of his conquests, and even ranked them by attractiveness and sexual prowess. In the light of this scandal, Meeke may have been more open to trying something new, while Sega would net not only a big name, but possibly a bit of attention-grabbing controversy. WanChai Connection is probably best viewed as a historically important game rather than one worth playing today. It's a plodding adventure game with questionable production values, and its story isn't much better than anything you might find in a typical 90s basic cable television series. But it's a crucial missing link between the largely shonen manga-influenced stories that dominated the 4th generation of consoles, and the more sophisticated narratives that emerged in the 5th generation. We'll be seeing a lot more games going forward that aim their storytelling towards a more adult audience, with varying degrees of success. On December 2nd, one day before the PlayStation's launch, Sega published 2 more games for the Saturn. The first of them, Gale Racer, is also the first racing game for the system. As with the PlayStation's debut racing game, Ridge Racer, it's a port of an arcade game, but Gale Racer doesn't fare quite as well. A conversion of the 1990 System 32 game, Radmobile, Gale Racer is stuck in an era when Sega's sprite-based superscalar technology was still considered cutting edge. As the debut game using Sega's powerful System 32 arcade platform, the original Radmobile was an impressive arcade game for its time. At its core, it's an update to the classic open-road race formula of Outrun, with a paper-thin story about a race from Los Angeles to New York, but it has some new tricks up its sleeve thanks to the System 32. The tracks are a natural evolution of Sega's previous arcade hit Power Drift, dense with hyper-realistic detail. The cars are just sprites, but they're huge and plentiful, smoothly scaling without even the slightest hint of slowdown. Cars even come towards you in the opposite lane on some tracks, adding a sense of realism to this cross-country road race. The viewpoint has been moved to a first-person perspective, complete with dashboard. This has put to good use of the few key points in the game when you need to turn your headlights on at night, or turn your windshield wipers on during rainstorms. The weather and lighting effects are impressive for a 1990 game, handily outclassing other sprite-based arcade racers of the time. While it may have set new visual benchmarks, Radmobile isn't a particularly great arcade game, and it was criticized even when it was new for being a shallow tech demo for Sega's new arcade hardware. The Japanese magazine Beep Mega Drive gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars in an arcade roundup, the equivalent of a pat on the head from some of Sega's staunchest supporters. British magazine Sinclair User was far more direct, damning it as extraordinarily dull. Even at the time, the game quickly became known primarily for being a footnote in history as the debut of Sonic the Hedgehog in the form of a rear-view mirror ornament. Radmobile does have its charms. This is still a Sega arcade game after all, and it's better than the vast majority of contemporary superscalar-style racing games from other manufacturers. But this is not Sega at its best. The controls lack the fine-tuned elegance of Outrun or Power Drift. The track design is monotonous, and the iffy collision detection often makes it difficult to determine if you're going to crash into another car or merely glide through it. You might pop a few quarters into it to check it out, but you'd be unlikely to get hooked. Gale Racer changes up a few things from the arcade original. The game opens with a CG FMV sequence, and there are a few other short FMVs sprinkled throughout the game, including a new ending. As you may expect from this era, the CG is not particularly impressive by modern standards though. In the game itself, the biggest change that will be immediately noticeable is that the cars are now polygonal. While it may seem as though this was a natural way to take advantage of the Saturn's power, it ultimately looks worse than the original sprites. The cars are texture mapped, but they look like they have a single-digit number of polygons, with even the tires being merely flat textures that lack animation. Plastered onto the unchanged 2D backgrounds, they stick out like a sore thumb. Gale Racer is a far jankier game than Radmobile. The frame rate is choppier than its arcade sibling. It's not bad per se, but it loses the smooth scaling that was a big part of what made the original so impressive. Your opponents and other vehicles on the road jerk around erratically, with the final segment vying for the top spot of your last rival being particularly comedic, as the other car shakes around randomly until a scripted moment when it flips over. But the thing that really kills Gale Racer is its loading times. The original Radmobile smoothly transitioned from stage to stage, but Gale Racer stops to load at every checkpoint. This is an arcade game that takes around 15 minutes to complete, and checkpoints are usually around 45 seconds apart. So while the loading times are short, Gale Racer is constantly interrupting its gameplay to load the next stage. This is inexcusably sloppy, especially when compared with Ridge Racer, which loads in its entirety over one brief session of Galaxy. There are a few other small additions to Gale Racer to round it out as a port, although none of these counteract its flaws. A handful of stages have been slightly reworked. The most notable of these changes is that a mountainside cliff section replaces the standard car opponents with a duel against a big rig truck. There's also a new arranged soundtrack, although it's jam-packed with irritating synth guitar. A basic split-screen two-player mode allows you to race a few track segments with a friend, and the time attack lets you practice each area of the game individually. While Radmobile was a Sega arcade original, developed by its internal AM3 division, the port was farmed out to System Satcom, a company with a surprisingly varied history. We'll be digging a bit deeper into System Satcom in the next game, which was also developed by the company and hews closer to its typical style. While System Satcom is not explicitly credited anywhere, its work on Gale Racer has been confirmed by one of its programmers, Hiroshi Ogino, who wrote an ebook documenting his time at the company, the title of which roughly translates to A Corner of the Game Industry, 1991 through 1994. GDRI, the Game Developer Research Institute, has translated portions of the book, which includes a chapter covering Ogino's work on the game. Ogino mentions that he was given access to the arcade cabinet and image and stage data, but no source code. Besides Ogino's first-hand account, there is a small nod to the game's System Satcom roots in its opening FMV, which features a moon emblem that was also in another System Satcom game published by Sega, Mansion of Hidden Souls for Sega CD. On the eve of Ridge Racer revolutionizing expectations for a next-generation racing experience, Gale Racer is almost shockingly outdated. Reviews at the time were overwhelmingly negative. Computer and video games gave it a scathing 17%, and even GameFan, usually a reliable hype machine for all things Sega, was harshly critical. Sega announced plans at one point for a US release, including it in a list of upcoming games in the press release for the US launch of the Saturn, and even apparently promising GameFan that problems with the game would be fixed, but nothing ever came of it. In fact, Sega didn't do anything with Radmobile after Gale Racer for over 25 years, only reviving it briefly in 2020 for inclusion on its Astro City mini console, alongside a handful of other System 32 games. That's probably for the best. A quick and sloppy port to fill out a launch lineup may have made sense for Sega with previous console launches like the Mega Drive, where there was time to slowly build up a library, but in the face of stiff competition like the PlayStation and Ridge Racer, it would need to start doing better if the Saturn was to stand a chance. The second Saturn game released on December 2nd, 1994 is Shinsetsu Yumimi Yakata, Tobira no Oko ni Dari Kaga, Our Real Dream Mansion, Someone Behind the Door, an FMV adventure game that is a sequel to the 1993 Mega CD game Yumimi Yakata no Monogatari, Our Story of the Dream Mansion. As with Gale Racer, the game was developed by System Satcom and published by Sega, but the two games couldn't be more different. The Yumimi Yakata series is better known in the West as Mansion of Hidden Souls, although the Mega CD version was released in Europe under the curiously literal translation Yumimi Mystery Mansion. These games have something of a small Western cult fandom, but they're still fairly obscure. There's even quite a bit of confusion around just the naming of these games, especially in America. While the Sega CD version was titled Mansion of Hidden Souls, the Saturn version was titled The Mansion of Hidden Souls, with only the added "the" differentiating the two titles. Because of that, it is often assumed that the Saturn version, which was released in America and Europe in late 1995, is simply a port of the Sega CD game with improved FMV. But it is indeed a sequel, albeit one with only a few direct ties to its predecessor. The unifying premise behind the Mansion of Hidden Souls series is the existence of a mansion that sits between our reality and another world. This mansion only materializes in the real world under a full moon, and those who enter it will leave their corporeal forms behind to become butterflies. The mansion is inhabited by these butterflies, who once lived human lives before they decided they'd prefer to live in the titular Dream Mansion. The premise of Mansion of Hidden Souls is admittedly pretty strange, especially for a console game from the mid-90s. While it was greeted with a warm reception in Japan, where it received a 32 out of 40 from Famitsu and was more recently included as one of the Mega CD titles on Sega's Mega Drive Mini 2 console, Western reception of the first game was mixed. EGM's review crew gave it scores ranging between 9 and 6, while relegating the review text to a single paragraph. GamePro was mostly positive, while still dismissing it as a clone of the early PC CD-ROM hit The Seventh Guest. But Video Games Magazine named it among the worst games of 1994, again bringing up The Seventh Guest comparison while griping about the game's short length. It's clear that the American console-focused game magazines of the time didn't have the context to fully understand what Mansion of Hidden Souls was really trying to do. Nor did its American publisher, Vic Tokai, which tried to sell the game with this goofy ad featuring a radical dude who was literally shocked by the horrors contained within. Mansion of Hidden Souls is thick with eerie atmosphere, but it doesn't really deliver much in the way of traditional horror. Nor is it really appropriate to compare it with The Seventh Guest, a game that's built on a mix of brain teasers and campy live-action storytelling.
My, isn't this a cheery place?
Edward, I'm not sure we should have been here today.
Why? Because it's a spooky old house? Don't worry, dear. I'll watch out for you.
Instead, Mansion of Hidden Souls is a continuation of a style of game that was popular in Japan, but practically unknown in the West at the time. a decidedly Japanese take on the graphical adventure that developer System Satcom had already been refining for years before it made Mansion of Hidden Souls. System Satcom isn't a particularly well-known developer, especially in the West, but it has a fascinating and deep history. Founded in 1981, System Satcom began its life as a hardware manufacturer specializing in computer peripherals, but soon expanded into other fields, including video games. Its earliest games, such as 1983's Valiant and 1986's Highway Star, were for NEC's popular PC-9801 line of computers. These were credited to Mark Flint, who was hailed as a genius programmer for feats such as the polygonal engine behind Highway Star, which delivered a relatively smooth 3D racing experience within the limitations of early PC-9801 hardware. Later on, Mark Flint would also work on Famicom Disk System games such as Moonball Magic as part of the Disk Original Group, our dog, a group that included System Satcom as well as several other developers, most notably a pre-Final Fantasy Square. To this day, Mark Flint's identity is a bit of a mystery. Despite his name, he is believed to be Japanese, and he does seem to be a real person, even if it's quite possible he's using a pseudonym. A compilation released for PC-9801 featuring his early games, all about Mark Flint, only features a pixelated and obscured photo of a man on the cover. There is an interview of him by now defunct Japanese gaming website G-Para from 2006, which can now only be retrieved from the Wayback Machine, but unfortunately the images were not archived. He does talk a bit about his time at System Satcom, and confirms that he also worked on at least the Sega CD version of Mansion of Hidden Souls. Starting in 1988, System Satcom's game development focus started to shift away from Mark Flint's action-oriented games towards more narrative-heavy works with its Novelware series. These are Japanese adventure games taking influence from popular titles like Yuji Horii and Chunsoft's Portopia Renzoku Sasuten Jiken, or the Portopia Serial Murder Case, which differed from Western graphical adventures in their first-person perspective and emphasis on storytelling over inventory-driven puzzle solving. But as the Novelware name suggests, these games move further towards what would eventually be known as visual novels, limiting player control in favor of narrative. Although the Novelware games aren't strictly considered visual novels by modern genre standards, due to still retaining some of the freedom of the classic Japanese adventure game style. The first Novelware game, 1988's Dome, was released for most of the popular Japanese computer platforms of the time, including the PC-9801 and X68000. It's based on a novel by Japanese writer Shizuku Natsuki, probably best known in the West for her novel Murder at Mount Fuji. The titular Dome is a shelter designed to protect humans after a nuclear war. You may expect such a premise to result in the game set in a post-apocalyptic dystopia, but the game actually takes place in a normal Japanese office, where you, as an employee of an advertising agency, are tasked with finding ways to promote the dome so money can be raised for its construction. While the presentation is simple, the use of digitized photographs stands out, especially for a game from 1988. It's definitely not what you might expect, but it shows how System Satcom was already thinking about how to tell stories in video games that bucked against the norms. There were eventually 7 Novelware games released, ranging across a variety of genres, including forays into sci-fi, horror, and even comedy in a slyly meta-satire of the game industry, Soft de Hard Namonogatari, in which you play the son of the CEO of a thinly veiled fictional version of System Satcom. After your father becomes ill, you must temporarily take over running the company while he recovers, and of course hijinks ensue. As with several other games in the Novelware series, Soft Hard Monogatari uses digitized black and white manga drawings to great effect.
Look, a butterfly.
Wow! Look how it just floats in the air.
So carefree, so beautiful. Hey, let's follow it to see where it goes. Maybe it'll fly to the flower garden under the old elm tree.
No way! We better go home or we'll be in big trouble. Besides, Grandma told us never to go anywhere near the elm tree. Remember, she said that there's ghosts there, and that they turn us into butterflies if we stared at one long enough, especially during a full moon.
You said there was no such thing as ghosts. Besides, I think it would be fun to be a butterfly.
Hey, wait! No! Where am I? How can this be? There was no mansion here before.
Jonathan, over here! Quick, I'm over here!
The Sega CD version of Mansion of Hidden Souls isn't nearly as text-heavy as the Novelware games, nor does it so thoroughly remove agency from the player. The Novelware games often had extended segments that are purely narrative with no player control. But it's clear that System Satcom's work in developing narrative-heavy adventure games was crucial to the game's development. You can see this just in the confidence of its storytelling and presentation. The game plays out from immediately after the Sega logo right into an introduction that sets up the premise and throws you directly into the beginning of the game, with only a brief pause for a title screen. In a nod to the first-person perspective of the Novelware games and other Japanese adventure games of the era, the viewpoint almost never breaks from the first person, other than the brief game over sequence. While there isn't that much voice acting in the game, every line is voiced. There is virtually no written text in the game. The soundtrack, by Ryuichi Sakamoto protege and occasional Studio Ghibli collaborator Yuji Nomi, hits every right note, from the stately and melancholic waltz of the introduction to the ethereal loops and drones that accompany you as you explore the mansion. For a game that was on the cutting edge for its time, it's presented with an incredible amount of stylistic verve and confidence. The protagonist of Mansion of Hidden Souls is Jonathan, a boy who is out in the field at night playing with his sister Samantha when they come upon a butterfly. Jonathan relays a tale he heard from his grandmother about ghosts that turn people into butterflies during a full moon. Samantha, perhaps expressing a childish whim, thinks it would be fun to be a butterfly and runs off. A pan up of the camera reveals a full moon in the sky, then the pan back down reveals a mansion and a title screen. Jonathan enters the mansion, wondering to himself how it just mysteriously appeared, only to hear Samantha calling him in the distance. Exploring the mansion is a simple matter of four-way directional movement. Like many early FMV adventures, exploration is node-based. You navigate from one location to the next, with brief FMV transitions as you walk around or zoom in on objects of interest. As you move around the mansion, you come upon its various inhabitants, all of whom are blue butterflies who abandoned their past lives as humans. There's an immature young girl cajoling you into joining her for tea.
I have prepared some tea in a room near here. Won't you join me?
A musician who expresses regret over becoming a butterfly.
I remember when I was human. I was on a small stage together with my friends and I played the piano. Now I cannot even touch the keys. I had many pressures and I felt there was no other choice. So at the time I thought it would be wonderful to be like a butterfly, to be carefree. I know now that I made the wrong decision.
A creepy butterfly collector giving you the hard sell on taking up the butterfly lifestyle.
What do you think? They're gorgeous, ain't they? I think the butterfly's as beautiful as the soul. I visited this mansion to obtain this shape, the shape of souls. Why don't you become a butterfly and lose that ugly human form?
A friendly and helpful painter.
I assume you'd like to be a butterfly. If so, take my word for it. Never venture below the main floor.
And a mocking middle-aged woman with a Romani accent that veers just a bit too hard into stereotype.
Did you hear that? That was the voice of your sister. You want to see her? I don't think so.
As you talk to these characters and solve the odd, simple puzzle here and there, you'll occasionally hear your sister in the distance, increasingly distraught as she realizes she's really going to be turned into a butterfly even though she doesn't want to.
Who are you? I'm not alone, you know. I'm with my brother. Jonathan? Jonathan, where are you?
Mansion of Hidden Souls is a short game, and a simple one. For around the first 2/3 of the game, you'll simply be going around the mansion trying to trigger the next event. It might at first seem that it's impossible to die, but when the third act kicks in, you're suddenly very much in danger. This is done in a way that's a bit on the trollish side, as you will die instantly simply by going one step too far. Then very shortly afterwards, instant death is again one wrong move away. In the last stretch of the game, you're on a fairly strict timer to solve a final series of puzzles, which seriously ratchets up the tension. But since the game allows you to save anywhere and there are 3 save slots, it's unlikely to lead to much in the way of lost progress as long as you are careful about saving frequently. Mansion of Hidden Souls has its share of flaws. While its CG is impressive for 1993, the limitations of the Sega CD mean that the FMV is grainy and choppy. As with many Japanese adventure games, it also ties its progression to a lot of specific, often seemingly arbitrary event triggers. As a somewhat awkward workaround for this, there is a hint system built into the game. Looking into a mirror in a certain location will reveal where you need to go next. It's a band-aid, but it's better than nothing. And Mansion of Hidden Souls is ultimately a pretty slight and simple game, a proof of concept for how this evolution of Japanese adventure games could work. But the story's relative simplicity belies the symbolism that lies under the surface. This is a much more artfully told narrative than you'd expect from a 16-bit console game. In Western mythology, butterflies have a fairly straightforward interpretation as symbols of metamorphosis and rebirth. But butterflies in Japan can have some more esoteric meanings. In the article Cultural Lepidopterology in Modern Japan, Butterflies as Spiritual Insects in the Akihabara Culture, Dr. Hideto Hoshina lays out some of the ways butterflies are used symbolically in Japanese culture. They are often used to represent souls, and their flight can symbolize a connection between the real world and the dream world, both of which thematically connect to the game. But there's an even further connection. Butterflies in Japan have had a long tradition in art as representations of a girl's journey into womanhood, and Mansion of Hidden Souls is about rescuing a young girl who expresses a desire to turn into a butterfly. So we must ask if Mansion of Hidden Souls is about Jonathan's anxieties as much as it is about rescuing his damseled sister. Is Jonathan worried about losing his sister as she enters womanhood? Is any of this real, even within the context of the game, or is the mansion all a manifestation of Jonathan's psychological anxieties? The game's original title is Story of the Dream Mansion after all. Applying this kind of analysis to an old video game may seem absurd, but something about the way Mansion of Hidden Souls adroitly navigates its dream logic invites interpretation. You can ignore all this and simply take Mansion of Hidden Souls as an artfully crafted, minimalist adventure game in the 90s multimedia CD-ROM mold. But there's a lot more lying under the surface here than it may first appear. While a game of this type and vintage may be a bit too slow and creaky for most folks, it's highly recommended for anyone with even a hint of interest in adventure games or 90s multimedia.
Wait, young lad. Where are you going? Don't go!
The Saturn game arrived in Japan almost exactly a year after the Japanese release of its predecessor. While it does have some direct ties to the Sega CD game, it has a largely new cast of characters, including a new protagonist, June. Unlike Jonathan, June is a butterfly who has been living in the mansion for an undetermined period of time. We never learn much about June or why they first came to the mansion. The given name June in Japanese can belong to either gender, so it seems that June has purposefully been left as an anonymous player avatar. June is enjoying another night of just butterflying around when they're summoned by the mansion's elder.
Welcome, June. What are you doing over there? Come here. June, how long is it since you last came here? Well, since turning my back on human society and changing my form to that of a butterfly. Oh, no. I haven't called you here to talk about the old days. It appears that Mike has come too.
June, you're here too. Can I help you, Elder?
They're joined by another butterfly, Mike, a cheery British gent. There's a full red moon out tonight, and that's a bad omen. The Elder tasked June and Mike with investigating. As with the Sega CD game, this leads to another round of poking about the mansion and talking to a new set of inhabitants. A few seem to have carried over from the previous game, although they might just be repeated archetypes. There's Kathy, a little girl who's sweet but has a slightly twisted side. Jossie, another middle-aged woman who embodies some Romani stereotypes, although at least the accent is dropped. Raymond, who was an adventurer in his human life. Sean, a frightened young boy who loves plants. Nezumi, a greedy shopkeeper in Lush. And Danny, a brutish man with a dark past. Eventually, a blue book gets stolen, which then leads to a series of increasingly improbable and inexplicable twists that somehow escalate to a life-and-death finale on another plane of reality, as two supernatural beings duke it out via philosophical musings on the nature of the mansion. The Mansion of Hidden Souls doesn't have the simplicity or elegance of the Sega CD game, and its overly literal explanation falls flat compared to its predecessor's tasteful ambiguity. But it definitely goes places. The lack of cohesive narrative makes it a slog for most of its brief runtime, but the occasional bizarre detours, and especially the batshit ending, almost make up for it. The game is extremely easy for the most part. There are a few ways you can die, but there's no time limit as there was at the end of the Sega CD game, and there really isn't even anything approaching a puzzle. The sole gameplay addition is the ability to answer simple yes or no questions when talking with characters. It seems like this was considered a key gameplay element during development, as the one option in the game settings is a switch between normal and easy mode, which just flips whether or not an on-screen prompt appears when a dialogue choice is available. Most of these answers don't have much of an effect other than some slightly different dialogue, or skipping a bit of optional dialogue, but a handful of life or death consequences. This could have worked out well, but in practice it just means that you're randomly going to take a cheap death or two throughout the game.
This is supposed to be Nozumi's room.
Hi there. Do you like this painting? I painted this. Everyone is individually painting his own mind inside himself. In this room you can see them all. You should be able to see your own here. Well, please don't take what I said too seriously. I am only a painter. The painting you have in your mind seems rather ugly. It has suspicious eyes, a sarcastic smile, and is holding a knife which could hurt someone. But that sort of human is not at all welcome in this mansion.
You can save whenever you want again, but this time you need to go to a specific location to save, which just artificially pads out a game that's already shorter than its already short predecessor. Furthermore, the changes to the game's style to add more dialogue do not work to its benefit. Having Mike around constantly commenting on everything gets annoying in record time, and none of these characters are appealing or enjoyable. It speaks a lot to the quality of the game's dialogue that its best known part is this unhinged clip from Classics of Game, in which Kathy tells a story that freaks Mike the fuck out.
Hey, Kathy!
Will you play with me?
What would you like to play?
Okay then, I'll tell you a story. Please listen. Once upon a time, there was a strange, enchanting place. Clouds always filled the sky, so it was very dark. Everybody stayed very still. But when the clouds went away and the moon appeared, that's when the festival began. Then everybody went out hunting to get food for a big party. And guess what they ate for the big feast?
Ah!
The FMV quality has improved immensely, but a jarring new addition is the presence of human faces when the butterflies are talking. It seems like System Satcom was trying to flex its CG prowess by showing off human faces, but they're mostly short loops, and they look absolutely goofy as hell. Other than that though, the new CG looks quite nice. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like Yuji Nomi returned to compose the soundtrack. Whoever filled in provided some pleasant atmospheric synth ambience, but it lacks the depth and subtlety of Nomi's score. The reception to the Mansion of Hidden Souls in Japan wasn't quite as positive as its predecessors. Famitsu's score only dropped 2 points, down to a 30 out of 40. Still a respectable score based on Famitsu's standards at the time. But in the Japanese Sega Saturn magazine's final ranking of all Saturn games at the end of the console's life, it ranked 749th out of 945 releases. It met utter indifference in the West, with a number of major magazines simply outright ignoring it. GamePro gave out one of its rare, unambiguously negative reviews, while Next Generation gave it a middling 3 out of 5 stars, but the review is so far off base that it seems like the reviewer didn't bother to actually play it. The Mansion of Hidden Souls isn't as easy to recommend as its Sega CD predecessor. It does have some of its own charms, but it's undeniably a sloppier and less satisfying game. However, it is very short and demands almost nothing of the player, so it might be worth a run-through, especially if you enjoyed the Sega CD game. System Satcom would return to the style again several more times, usually with more successful results, including another game that ties into the Mansion of Hidden Souls series. But that's a story for another day.
Let's get you home.
The final game released for the Saturn in 1994 arrived on December 9th, and it's the best demonstration of the Saturn's power yet. Published by Sega and developed by an internal team, Clockwork Knight is the Saturn's first side-scrolling platformer. But this is no ordinary platformer. It's the first attempt at what would eventually be called a 2.5D platformer. While the gameplay is constrained to 2 dimensions as with classic platformers such as Sonic and Mario, backgrounds are rendered with polygonal objects that occasionally interact with the player. Although it's more of a proof of concept than a fully fleshed out adventure, Clockwork Knight makes a strong case for the classic side-scrolling platformer having a home in the 5th generation landscape. Clockwork Knight thrusts you into the role of Sir Tangara de Pepperocho III, usually just Pepper for short, a mechanical knight toy figure who comes to life at night along with the other toys that reside in a typical suburban home. Pepper is in love with Chelsea, the princess whose singing awakens the toys every night at the stroke of midnight when she emerges from a cuckoo clock. You can probably already predict what happens next. Chelsea is captured by mysterious forces, compelling the brave but bumbling Pepper to dash off to her rescue. Clockwork Knight's gameplay is almost exactly like a typical 16-bit platformer. In many ways, it's a throwback to a style of platformer even simpler than many of its 16-bit contemporaries. A and C jump, while B attacks with Pepper's weapon, which looks suspiciously like the inspiration for the Keyblades of Kingdom Hearts. While pressing B only once unleashes a quick thrust, tapping it multiple times in rapid succession locks Pepper into place and sends him into a twirling attack that lasts as long as the button is being tapped. Many enemies are only stunned by a single hit, so you'll frequently need to stun them with a quick attack, then finish them off with the twirl. You also have the option of picking up stunned enemies and a handful of other objects, like springs that can be used to jump higher. This can sometimes be a bit frustrating to pull off since objects are picked up by holding the B button, which can also trigger a regular attack, but the game is rarely demanding enough that this becomes a major problem. Held objects can be hurled at enemies to do damage, a technique that isn't utilized as much as it could be, although it's crucial in one particular boss fight. Pepper moves at a jaunty pace, and a double tap of left or right initiates an even faster run, which can be used to make longer jumps. It's also possible to push some objects, which is used for some very basic puzzle solving in a few spots. There are a handful of the typical power-ups for restoring health, granting temporary invincibility, and increasing your stock of lives. You can also collect bottle caps, which are used as currency to play a simple bonus game at the end of every area to obtain more lives. Clockwork Knight is the first real graphical showcase for the Saturn, mixing polygons and sprites with surprising fluidity and artistic panache. Boxes that are stood up in the background wobble and tumble over as Pepper approaches, threatening to crush him even as they create safe paths for him to traverse across dangerous obstacles. A toy train shuttles Pepper around, then fades into the background as the track bends. Enemies wait in the background, then zoom into attack. Clockwork Knight doesn't get too ambitious with these touches, keeping the gameplay locked to the 2D plane, but it's extremely effective at using the layers behind the 2D playfield to add some spice to what is otherwise a very traditional side-scroller. Pepper and most enemies are 2D sprites. They are pre-rendered a la Donkey Kong Country rather than being pixel art, but they blend in remarkably well with the polygonal graphics. The platforms and many interactable objects in the levels are polygonal. They're fully texture mapped and impressively varied. Everything runs at a smooth clip with virtually no slowdown. It's no surprise that code from Clockwork Knight eventually found its way into libraries in the Saturn Developers Toolkit. Clockwork Knight isn't just a technical showcase for the Saturn though, it's also an effortless flex of Sega's artistic muscle. Everything pops with color, and even minor enemies like anthropomorphized sticks of dynamite are alive with little touches, such as the shades they wear displaying a countdown until they explode. Even the 2D backdrops at the far background are chock full of unique art. At times it may be a bit too demented to appeal to the younger demographics that were so keen to embrace Sonic, but anyone with an appreciation for the more experimental side of Sega's 90s aesthetic will find a lot to appreciate here. And the best is saved for last, with the final boss being a maniacal CRT television with robotic arms that looks like a Namjoon Pike installation come to life. Clockwork Knight takes a lot of chances, but its basic premise of traditional toys coming to life is one with a lot of potential commercial appeal. It would be easy to assume Sega was trying to get some heat off of Pixar and Disney's groundbreaking and massively popular Toy Story. This is extremely unlikely though, because Toy Story didn't premiere in theaters until a year after the Saturn's Japanese launch. But it may have been influenced by Pixar's 1988 short, Tin Toy, which was the spiritual precursor to Toy Story. This one shot in particular shows off a lineup of unruly toys very similar to Clockwork Knight's supporting cast. What's more likely though is that the developers at Sega realized the same thing that Pixar realized around the time of Tin Toy. Making realistic humans look good in 3D animation is hard. It's much easier to make characters that are more abstract, like action figures, so their unnatural or mechanical movements aren't as jarring. In the only developer interview for the game, conducted by the Japanese Sega Saturn magazine with producer Noriyoshi Oba, and thankfully translated by the ever-reliable Shmuplations, Oba mentions that the game originally had a darker and more serious fantasy tone, but he only offers the explanation that the world and characters lacked appeal. One thing we do have a surprising amount of is pre-release coverage of Clockwork Knight. It was one of the most heavily hyped early Sega Saturn games, behind only Panzer Dragoon and ports of big arcade hits like Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA. There's quite a few early screenshots of it in magazines, usually accompanied with overwhelmingly positive impressions. There's also a pre-production target render video that's been preserved, which portrays a game far more ambitious than anything the Saturn could ever realistically pull off. Although it's likely the video was meant to simply demonstrate the game's concept rather than be reflective of the final product. Clockwork Knight never had a snowball's chance in hell of becoming the next Sonic, but it's a satisfying snack of a platformer that's buoyed by the finely honed polish that Sega's Japanese consumer development teams had down to a science by the time the Saturn rolled around. It pioneered the side-scrolling 2.5D style, which endures in popularity to this day, and it holds up surprisingly well considering it's doing something no game had done before. But its big problem is that it's a little too insubstantial for its own good. It's essentially 4 Sonic zones worth of content, and it's easy enough that it's unlikely to last more than an afternoon. It's very clear that this is an unfinished game that had a large chunk of content cut before release. This is borne out by the game's Japanese subtitle, Pepperlocho no Daiboken Jokan, or Pepperlocho's Big Adventure, first volume. The Geikon, our last volume, arrived in Japan a mere 7 months later, and was released in the rest of the world as simply Clockwork Knight 2. Clockwork Knight isn't quite a lost masterpiece, but it's one of the early Saturn games that has held up well enough to still be worth checking out today. Despite its brevity, it's one of the best games from the first batch of Saturn and PlayStation releases, and definitely a contender for the best that isn't an arcade port. So while the Saturn's library is still a little light compared to the PlayStation's in quantity, it's quickly picking up in quality.
You can trust me with all your dreams, baby. You will never lose my love. Yes, I promise you this
I hope you enjoyed this debut episode of Saturn Side. These first few months of the Saturn's life were rough, but we're just about to turn the corner. When we next return to the Saturn, we'll cover its early 1995 releases, including another adventure from our friends at System Satcom. Until then, you can keep up with all the latest Saturn Side and PlayStation Experiment news by subscribing to the channel, and following me on the many social media services that now exist. I'm on Twitter and co-host as FamiConsumer, Blue Sky as FamiConsumer.com, and Mastodon as FamiConsumer@digipress.club. You can also visit the new PlayStation Experiment companion website at PlayStationExperiment.FamiConsumer.com. Till next time, friends.